Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Back in February, I did a Moment of Truth talking about Christopher Rufo and the racist hysteria that he likes to promote, asking whether or not he ought to be held responsible for not merely the racial hostility, but also the economic, political, and physical violence that follows from all of this race baiting that he does. That was months ago. But in light of the race massacre that took place in Buffalo a couple of days ago, the white media, pulling up the rear as always, are finally getting around to asking a similar question. They just haven't brought up Christopher Rufo's name. I think that they should. After Saturday's mass race murder in Buffalo, the white media has been trying to get some of their credibility back by pretending to actually tackle the subject. They've even had some of the usual suspects who have been trying to appropriate some of our language because they understand the black media says what's actually relevant. But even so, they understood what they could and couldn't say. You had the president of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, who was on CNN, and what he said was that if you have the government able to use RICO laws to prosecute rappers for their lyrics, then the government also needs to be using those laws against domestic terrorists, as he put it. My problem with that is we need to be specific here. It was not Muslim extremists who did this. It wasn't a bunch of brigands from Central America who did it. It wasn't a bunch of guys from the IRA who did it. It was a bunch of white supremacists who did this. We cannot allow the enemy any wiggle room when it comes to this. Domestic terrorism is fine, but you got to put a name on it, and the name for it is white supremacy. Because when you don't, then you give plenty of room for trash like Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III to run around saying that there's a black identity extremist wave that needs to be fought. Or maybe it's Antifa, or Black Lives Matters, or what have you. So that's the reason why we got to make sure that we specifically say white supremacists. But you got other talking heads on white media cable who are already saying that this Payton Gendron guy, he sounds crazy, probably obviously crazy. The standard line that gets brought out whenever the mass killer is white. If the guy's white, then there must be something wrong with him. He surely couldn't be sane because, he's white, so obviously there must be something wrong with him mentally. But this is part of the lie that the dominant society has to maintain. They know that there's absolutely nothing wrong with Payton Gendron at all, just like there was nothing mentally wrong with Dylan Roof. They are part of a society that has extended them every sort of privilege, every sort of perk and comfort simply by benefit of the color of their skin. And then, after hand-delivering and spoon-feeding them every crumb of their daily bread for so long, this society also decides to psychologically masturbate them by telling them all their problems are the result of black people. Now, when you take the people in the society who have the most money, the most privilege, and the least legal restrictions, and you feed them a phony white victim narrative, you're prompting them to use their privilege and immunity from law to commit violence. You didn't have to wait until this Saturday to understand that there has been a long-standing, hyper-aggressive effort to demonize black people that's been going on for a while now. And some of the main people who are behind it are the ones who the white media doesn't talk about. What a surprise. Christopher Rufo and Ron DeSantis, they know exactly what they're doing when they spread their racial hysteria. The violence that they encourage is the entire point. That's the objective. By the way, scumbag Rufo, he himself refuses to say a word about white replacement theory or the Buffalo massacre because he knows that that killer's manifesto sounds exactly like the poorly veiled hate speech and racial hysteria that Rufo peddles. In fact, Rufo himself took aim at Buffalo. Last year, Rufo was posting a Twitter storm attacking Buffalo's school system. He placed special emphasis on centering his attacks on any sort of lesson plans that talk about the deaths of black children. Now, when somebody's going on a crusade to ban any mention of Trayvon Martin's murder or Anna Jones' murder or Tamir Rice's murder from classrooms, that's also someone who doesn't want you to teach about Emmett Till either. That's the point these racists like Rufo are trying to reach. They don't want to talk about the 4 little black girls who were burned to death in the 16th Street Baptist Church burning either. Because this is the racialist agenda Christopher Rufo is pushing. He wants to outlaw the teaching of history in America, period. But he made sure to single out Buffalo last year as his target for special notice. Now, his pathetic race baiting failed to get any traction there because he's in a blue state. He seemed to forget it's not Florida. But it goes to show that he put Buffalo on a lot of white supremacist radar. A serious effort needs to be made to investigate Christopher Rufo and see who has he been in contact with. As many white supremacists quote him chapter and verse and clearly take Cliff Notes versions of his rantings, we need to see whether his anti-black hate-mongering simply stops at Twitter tweets and hanging out with bigoted politicians, or if perhaps Rufo has taken a more hands-on role in the violence that his racist rhetoric encourages. Remember, Tucker Carlson has a direct connection to white supremacists. You'll recall that just 2 years ago, one of the writers for his show was exposed as having posted racist messages online for several years under an assumed name. This, of course, came as no surprise to anyone. The reason Tucker Carlson's show sounds like it was written by a racist online troll is because the writers for his show are racist online trolls. So when you see racists like Payton Gendron posting on message boards like 4chan and others, the first question you need to be asking is, do any of the name brand white supremacist mouthpieces that we see on cable TV or on the internet or in political circles also hang out in those chat rooms, discussing and even planning violence to be carried out? A person with common sense knows they can judge someone by the company they keep. But as we know from Dylan Roof and Payton Gendron's so-called manifestos, these guys talk about how they spent a lot of time online communicating with other white supremacists, discussing and planning the violence that they intended to carry out. My question is Christopher Rufo perhaps one of those people that the Payton Gendrons and Dylan Roofs have been talking to? As much time as Rufo spends online annoying people, I don't think it's much of a stretch to ask if maybe he's got a couple of sock puppet accounts that he uses on 4chan or Reddit or any of these other white supremacist sewers so that he can say what he really thinks. He loves to brag about the part that he played in the legislation that came out of Texas and Florida, how he was instrumental and key to that. My question is, has he been also instrumental in any of the violence that's taken place? There needs to be a serious inquiry into Christopher Rufo so we can determine whether or not his involvement with these white supremacists goes beyond just giving them rhetorical encouragement. He's desperately hoping that no one's going to point out how he's been one of the main people spreading racial hysteria about white people being under threat because schools are teaching history. I've been talking about that scumbag for the longest time. When you have people who make it a point to spread phony outrage, moral panic, and racial hysteria, you shouldn't be allowed to deny that you had anything to do with it just because you weren't the one who pulled the trigger. Rufo and his ilk encourage the people who do, and they do it deliberately. Now, you've probably seen a term being bandied about the last 48 hours or so, stochastic terrorism. Basically, it means the use of mass media to provoke random acts of ideologically motivated violence that are statistically predictable, but individually unpredictable. Basically, it means that you have these racist rhetoricians like Christopher Rufo running around preaching a doctrine of white victimhood simply because history is apparently anti-white, and apparently facts are anti-white, and reality is anti-white, and black people just keep insisting on history and facts and reality being the norm. And what you teach is that this is white oppression somehow. And if you just go ahead and make sure to put this guy on Tucker Carlson, the Manhattan Institute, make sure to book him on some cable TV shows, and make sure that you spread his racist rantings far and wide, well, you play the numbers game, and sooner or later, law of averages kicks in, and a few of the people who see this racial hysteria are going to act on it. You don't know who, but it doesn't matter who. All that matters is, sooner or later, somebody is going to act on it. You have professional white supremacist race baiters who keep up a steady drumbeat of anti-black rhetoric, deliberately demonizing the most powerless people in the society as a means to galvanize their white supremacist base, which they hope to use to magnify their own personal power. They know exactly the buttons they're pushing. That's why they're doing it. The Manhattan Institute, which Rufo works for, has spent decades paying the likes of Charles Murray, the guy who wrote The Bell Curve, and Heather McDonald, who wrote her fiction book The War on Cops, to write racist hate tracts aimed specifically at ginning up as much anger, fear, and outrage against black people as they can, trying to mask their plain anti-black racism by using scholarly-type words, which have no bearing on the subject. But they figure that if they fill their hate tracts with $10 words and a couple of very poorly made quote-unquote statistics, then people will be fooled into thinking that what they're saying is somehow intellectual. That's called baffling people with BS. But the asinine racism these people peddle is anything but harmless. The white supremacists who applaud the Christopher Rufos, they know that what he says are more or less total lies. Hell, you can go on Twitter and they'll admit that they know he's lying and that it's all phony hysteria, but they then say that, well, they have to do it because the left must be stopped, the Democrats do it all the time, etc. So they know what the con is here, but they're so desperate for some kind of win because their egos are so fragile that if they see that black people are even able to assert themselves in the public square, why, white control is under attack, we're losing everything. If all they can get is a couple of red states to ban the teaching of history in schools as their form of racist political theater, if that's all they can get, they'll settle for that, because they've seen that they're taking so many L's across the board everywhere else. Christopher Rufo's entire job is to stoke as much white rage and fury as he possibly can. That's what these white supremacist think tanks pay him to do. Well, the phony outrage that Rufo's been pushing and spreading has caused real deaths. White replacement theory is the demographic equivalent of saying critical race theory, because the fear that both of these theories capitalize on is that whiteness will no longer convey any special status in the U.S. And the people who spout these theories, they state them and push them in such a way as to make it clear that the white people who hear this message, they need to do something. They're facing an existential crisis. I mean, they're teaching history, for God's sake. This'll wipe the white race out. Rufo himself is not merely a mouthpiece for this racist dogma. He makes it a point to stand and smile for the cameras, standing beside the very political hate mongers like Abbott and DeSantis who are doing their extremist political theater based on this. Rufo is no different than a Karl Rove or a Steve Bannon, only he's not as smart. However, we can't let people dance around the issue or decide that they're going to tiptoe around the subject. We gotta come straight up the middle. Putting aside the NAACP's misuse of the incident, it is a fact that if the government does have the ability to put a RICO case on a rapper, not because he committed a crime, but because of his lyrics, then there's absolutely no excuse for why Christopher Rufo or Tucker Carlson can't be held accountable for what the racists they inflame with their rhetoric do. Charles Manson didn't personally kill anyone either. He just encouraged and whipped people into a frenzy so they would. This is white supremacy, and it's Democrats who are leading the charge to protect it. The person who is prosecuting Young Thug under the RICO statute is Fani Willis. Talk about the right tool for the job. But no prosecutors or Democratic lawmakers are moving to go on a crusade against white replacement theory. If white supremacist outfits like the Manhattan Institute can pay mental midgets like Christopher Rufo to whip up phony hysteria about critical race theory, then how much more devastating would it be for states like California and New York to go after white replacement theory and those who promote it? Because unlike the children's books that Christopher Rufo is so eager to ban, white replacement theory actually kills. And the only reason you wouldn't go after this racist rhetoric, which has been time and again proven to prompt violence against black people, is if you agree with it. But that's the problem. The dirty little secret is that Democrats are as committed to white supremacy as the Republicans, and that starts with white immunity from law. Would Hunter Biden be a free man today were it not for white privilege? They don't want to talk about what's going on with the phony RICO charge in Georgia because they know if they can justify locking up a black man merely for what they claim he says, then they'll have no excuse for not locking up Carlson or Rufo for what they actually said. Every system of oppression has to have people on the payroll whose job it is to tell lies to perpetuate the system, And it also must cultivate and protect people who will kill for those lies. It's the yin and yang of white power. Both political parties know it, and they count on it. It's like Voltaire said, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Eric Bailey, Mouse, Joel Hunton, Lo Have Mercy, and Morris Bodden. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.